Hello, my name is David Acco, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I want to wish everybody a good morning at GeoIgnite. And I thank Jonathan and Tessa for this opportunity to present to you the geoanalytic, our presentation on the geoanalytics and how geodata and analytics are advancing critical issues for Indigenous people across Canada. So this is sort of a continuation of my last talk that I had on 2019, and it sort of gives you an update of where we're at in terms of the development of the ideas that I put forth at the 2019. So I'm very pleased to come back and be able to talk to you about this. So I'm going to share my screen, and I got a great presentation for you regarding this subject. So I will basically share this screen here. And so I'm very pleased to bring this presentation to you. Before I get into it, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself because it sort of ties in together. So just to give you perspective, I have three parts of this in creating Acosys and how Acosys came about. I have a personal journey, I have a professional journey, and I have an activist journey. So on a personal level, I came from mixed parents. My mom is from North Saskatchewan. She's a Métis Cree from Cumberland House, born and raised. Ended up in Winnipeg to study nursing. And my dad was from Trinidad and Tobago, and he came to become a doctor. Eventually got married, and quickly my dad found himself with three children and dropping out of university, and my mom the same thing. But eventually my dad had lost his job at the moment I was born, and I almost became part of the 60s scoop because my dad was, when he was laid off, he was out of work, and of course the nurses and the social workers came up to my mom and asked if she wanted to give up her children, and she said no, and then 3 weeks later, when we were out of Canada and back in Trinidad with my parents and my father's family, and they basically escaped from Winnipeg. So I lived in Trinidad for about 4 years, from 3 weeks old to actually 3.5 years old. But my parents decided to settle in Montreal. They didn't go back to Winnipeg to be closer family. They got far away from it as possible. And I lived in Montreal most of my life, in Laval mainly. And it was typical what we call an urban Indigenous person. So, that kind of put me into a different set of realms or different set of realities. But what my parents did was they also brought me back and forth to work, to visit my parents, my kokam and my mushin, which means my grandmother and grandfather and my rest of my relatives who were living in Saskatchewan in Cumberland House. So they sent me there mostly every summer. And that's where I learned the traditional way of life. And my grandfather was an inland fisherman. He was also running a tourism camps, hunting camps for Americans and other Canadians. But he was also an inland fisherman. And my family continues this to this day. But underneath all of that, right from the moment from cradle to now, racism seemed to be a lot of a part of my life. It was tough growing up in the 70s and the 80s as an Indigenous kid, and when 1990s with the OCAP crisis was kind of the culmination point and then an inflection point. But underneath then, and of course we know that racism is alive and well in Canada, so we still have it today. But this is one of the things that actually formed the basis of where I wanted to go, as an entrepreneur, which brings me to my professional journey. So I studied arts and sciences in university, and what had what had changed was I was studying creative writing in adult ed, and decided to join the Air Force Reserve, where I learned more about aerospace. My dad was an engineer, so the apple didn't fall very far from the tree, and my mom was a writer, so the apple didn't fall so the other half didn't fall very far. What that I ended up doing was I ended up taking my creative writing and my aircraft maintenance certificate from the Air Force, slapping together, and ended up working in aerospace as a technical writer, and further on, and advancing my career into telecommunications as a business analyst and project management. And then I had an opportunity to go work in Germany for Infoterra at the time, which is now part of Airbus, and also working with DLR in the geospatial side. And that was a whole new experience, because it opened my eyes to geospatial and the power of geospatial has in terms of, with government, but also with industry, but also how it impacted community. So that I realized that Indigenous people needed to be part of a part of this technology instead of passive users. But when I left Germany in 2005 and 2006, I decided to start Acosys, and to answer that, that call to, building a safe space for Indigenous people to work. Which brings to my next, my activist journey. My activist journey was really started in, I'd say, 1990. I was floating along quite happily, not being involved in the Indigenous community, but when I was working in the Air Force, was gassing up helicopters that were going to fly over Indigenous communities, and then I'd had to go to work in wherever I'm working during the week, and then having to be an Indigenous apologist, explaining land claims and why there's an Oka crisis, and so on and so forth, and having to deal with, again, with the racism side of it, both in the military and also in corporate Canada as this Oka crisis went on. But it sort of galvanized me to become more involved in the Indigenous community as an Indigenous person. So one of the big stepping stones for me, I volunteered to work in the Aboriginal Engineering Summer Camp, which was running out of out of Concordia University in McGill, and I was building courses to get Indigenous youth involved in science and STEMs and in the 90s. A big turning point was, as a result of the Oka crisis, was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And when the bomb came, I was celebrated as one of the times where the first time in Canadian history that the government asked Indigenous people about Indigenous people. And it was a very big turning point. But what stuck with me was that the report identified, the lack of opportunity for Indigenous youth, and also the lack of training. And that kind of stuck with me. And for about 10 years, I kept on going to conferences and asking questions, what are we doing about that? I learned about the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business during those conferences, and I was also challenging Indigenous businesses to bring on more capacity, and I wasn't seeing it to my satisfaction. So when I went to Germany, I got to talking and thinking about these things, and decided that I was going to answer that call in starting my business. And of course, what I really didn't realize at the time, that I was really into the economic development side of the business and training side, which was actually economic reconciliation, which I found out through when the Truth and Reconciliation report came in and a call to actions, that I was actually doing Recommendation 92, since 2006, but really did not realize I was doing that. So let me tell you a little bit about Acosys. So Acosys, we're about people, innovation, and progress. So we want to deliver those skills and solutions and build Indigenous capacity. So zeroing on skills, we're very passionate about what we do, and we're providing information technology service, not only the resources, but building of solutions, which I'll talk a little bit about next section, but also around the human resources. So we're doing basically a human resources consulting, labor relations side of it, and that's my partner Julie Lepage started. She's a labor lawyer by trade. I started the information technology side of it. And she brought in Indigenous policy development as a labor lawyer, and being called to the bar of Ontario. So she brought that all in, and I brought information technology and geomatics. And we started to build up with business strategies and analysis, and it kind of flowed together with these three, three domains. And also, we brought in the project management side of it. Aboriginal policy development sort of pulls the thread through all of these things, because that's where it impacts. On the solution side, we do the end-to-end solutions that really are about custom solutions for the customer. And we do it in information technology, we do it in software development, we also do it in applications development, but also geospatial analysis. And that's relatively the tower that we're starting back in 2019 under Matt Ibis, who I think he's here, so somewhere down the ether. And also with my business partner, also with Fluvial Geospatial with Steve Bird, who's also here as well, somewhere in the ether. So working with them, they really started work on the geospatial analysis side of it. But we're always into the Indigenous capacity building, and we really focus on investing in people and career development, especially around STEMs, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics side for employment, and in Indigenous youth. And you can see the influence from my summer camp engineering days. We started an internship program back in 2008. It's been going on for the past, still going on today for the past 12 years now. And we have about 50-something on success stories. And what we do there is we take profit from our consulting practice, and we work with what they call wage subsidy, the ISETS program, the Indigenous Strategy for Employment and Training strategy. We work with the ISET holders who provide wage subsidy, and we actually put half of our money in and the other half from the wage subsidies when they were available. And we created a 52-week internship program. We ended up creating business analysts, project managers, project control officers, human resources specialists, and hopefully we're going to be able to create geospatial specialists as well as we go through this journey. And in doing that, we became experts at Indigenous engagement and also Indigenous hiring strategies and building a capacity. And government is leaning on us to help them with that as they build up their numbers, but also industry as well. No intern really lasts on my payroll. They end up being poached by my customers, which I really am very pleased about, because they become the really big success stories from our internship. So we're very happy to help them get their next job from Acosys to our customers, and this day they're doing very, very well. So that's Acosys in a nutshell. So let me tell you. So I want to set some context for you. So just to put it out there, a vast majority of Indigenous communities, they want to have, they want to be engaged in the natural resource development. They want to have a role. It's happening in their territory. So I'm just going through the numbers. There's about 450 agreements with mining companies since 2000. And there's 58 contracts, agreements with forestry companies, 58% of the communities out there. 25% of First Nations are oil producers, and natural gas, 35 produce natural gas on their territory. There's 3 separate Indigenous consortia that are vying to purchase Trans Mountain Pipe on behalf of their communities. I think I mentioned that last year. Indigenous communities are likely 40 times more likely to be involved in natural resources, mining, oil and gas, forestry, than the average Canadian business. They also employ twice as many Indigenous resources. It makes sense because that's, there's a good cohort of labor there. But they also provide those, mining and extraction and natural resources professions provide twice as many, pay. They pay twice as much than other sectors, industrial sectors. And I think this is the most telling about the change is the Indigenous land tenures at the time in 1980 was about less than 1%. And fast forward to 2017, it's really 10%. So getting close, that's probably over 10% right now in terms of land tenure. So Indigenous people have started to take back and participating even in the forestry industry. So having said that, I think the important portion of it is that it's not at any cost Okay, it has to have free, prior, informed consent before that, and it's written in. There's been cases on that, and where industry has lost, government has lost without that consent, and really around the consent is around Indigenous people wanting to make their own decisions about their land and resources, and it's vital to the distinctive culture and the way of life. Which includes traditional food and traditional ways of life and hunting that my grandfather has done when I went down to see him in Cumberland House. So government has come up with principles. I won't read them out to you, but these principles recognize that the nation-to-nation relationship that Indigenous people have with the Crown, and more specifically with Canada as a whole, how they work with industry. So this is where it's a good segue into why we're having this discussion, was how we decided to really approach our projects. And the way we're doing it is we're actually looking at geospatial data as a strategic partner or strategic source of information. And what we're doing is that we're also combining it with ITK, with Indigenous Traditional Knowledge, to deliver really culturally relevant solutions to the Indigenous community, to really answer that first call, not at any cost development. So, and what does that geospatial do for the Indigenous community? It helps them exert sovereignty over the territory. If you do not know what's in the territory, you don't know what's happening, you're not exerting sovereignty over it. So you need to know what's happening within your borders. Especially traditional land, it's vast, it's huge, So there's also environmental protection. There's also climate change adaptation. Different areas are getting warmer, and these are having adverse effects on the surrounding communities and also within their traditional territories. But also about building those equitable relationships with respect to natural resources. So they want to be involved in managing the resources and the land. They also want to build the capacity, to have the tools, to have the capacity, human resource capacity, but also the tools to take full advantage of sustainable development. And you'll see what the projects that we're working on and how we're answering that. And also sharing the economic development in a fair way. So it's not a zero-sum game. There's not going to be a winner or a loser in this one. So that data provides that equitable, that levels a playing field. So, and of course, we all rely on data. I'm not making this up. This is from NRCan. So, data is impacting the regulator is impacting the natural resource developer, the forestry companies, and, the scientists, the way they're looking at things, using data, but also the community as well. And of course, evidence-based policy making. I wish there was ITK in that picture as well, and hopefully the next iteration will include ITK as being part of that data science. So, therein lies the challenge. So having said that, I want to give you 3 projects that we're currently working on, where we're actually bringing in the Indigenous engagement, traditional knowledge, as part of the evidence-based policy decisions and sustainable development. So these are 3 projects that are currently happening within the Acosys. So the first project is, it's about fish conservation and habitat protection. So here's a map of Canada. So it's showing, the hydroelectric projects, from 10 megawatts all the way up to 1,000 plus megawatts. And they're all in traditional territory, or they're all in Indigenous territory, treaties or non, and recognized. So, so hydroelectric is impacting the community, but also the fact you got to remember that these are just hydroelectric. We're not talking about tailing ponds or other reservoir projects or anything like that. So we can put more on there, but zeroing in on the hydroelectric projects. Hydropeaking We're looking at in terms of the hydropeaking and the opening and closing of sluice gates, so the very short-term fluctuations of the power dam and so the sluice gates, the impacts of the water flow, the sediment entrainment, but also the vegetation encroachment and what's the adverse effects. So what are the variables? So the velocity of the water, the recession rate, when it's high, and it's the rise rate, when they open and close the sluice gates, and the drought durations, and the frequency. So where river used to flow freely, now it doesn't flow as freely. The other side of the coin is we're looking at, the channel width, the bank stability from gathering geospatial data, but also the vegetarian growth and other things, the riparian recruitment, the phreatic constancy, and of course the corridor continuity. So these, and I won't talk to this as much because I don't know enough to be dangerous. Steve Bird, who knows this well, who's on the call, probably be able to talk more about this during the question period, but I won't steal his thunder. But this is where we're looking at the hydropeaking, and this is where geospatial data and indigenous traditional knowledge kind of meet, and the rubber hits the road. One interesting thing that came out of this is also the methylmercury toxins that are in the environment. And this is a Harvard study that was done. They looked at 22 proposed projects, all of them, of course, in or around near Indigenous communities. And these projects are going to happen within the next 5 years. So inorganic mercury, it's occurring when there's a forest fire. They'll have mercury caused by that. They say volcanoes, cause an increase in mercury. Also, activities like development, of course, increase levels of mercury, but it gets absorbed into the soil. So what happens is when a dam comes in and they flood a particular area, the grass, the leaves, the soil, and so on and so forth, are put underneath water, and of course the bacteria eats it, and then that causes this methylmercury. And because of this bacteria being in, now it's getting ingested by the fish and of course the birds and larger animals that now have ingested mercury. And of course this ends up in the traditional food chain, with sturgeon and other fish and salmon, where where we get our traditional food. So when my uncle was saying I have higher amounts of mercury, I didn't make that connection until we started looking at that. When I started looking at the dam, because he was telling me before the dam, what was life before the dam, when he was a kid, and the Saskatchewan Dam, and, what's life after, and, saying that I have high levels of mercury inside my blood, now I could make that connection of, where he's getting it from is from the methylmercury in the river system, where he's living as an inland fisherman and working and living and eating fish from the river. So what's different about what we're doing? We're actually doing co-development approaches. So we're working with the community and community partners to deliver community-led methods and approaches. And we're also, on how the hydroelectric dam and the local fish species habitat, what are the impacts on it? So how we're doing this, we're integrating traditional knowledge with institute data. So because we have this ability in Acosys and as multidisciplines, we're able to build the applications that the Fishermen's Co-op can use to be able to collect the data, or youth can use it to collect the local data, working with traditional knowledge, trying to build it into the data models, but also taking the macro data from the geospatial. And we can use archival data to see what the trade, they've been taking pictures since the 90s, so going back into the archival data and being able to build these models, and proving out what traditional knowledge is saying. So traditional becomes a historical data set as well, and it also becomes a predictor of the future. Where they say it's a 100-year flood, it comes every 20 years, or whatever the situation might be. Now we're able to correlate all that data, and so we're hoping that the project ends up creating this inclusive long-term conservation and protection plans for the local fish species. and emphasizing how important it is for the economic and cultural practices for the community's partners. So as an integral source of the traditional food, but also traditional way of life. In the case of my uncle, who's an inland fisherman, and his family, and protecting that way of life within the interior of Canada. So that's one way of looking at it. The other project we're looking at is the emergency management, and this is the floodplain mapping guidelines that we're participating in. What we're playing in is the community engagement side of it, and looking at the guidelines for the floodplain mapping, but also how dissemination of data is, how we're going to conduct risk assessment and also mitigation, but involving the community in a collaborative model. So the model that we came up with, looking at this, is basically looking at engaging with the community and coordinator, and the community coordinator is, they work very closely with leadership, and they also set up the engagement sessions, and also looking at the pilot projects that can be worked as part of building out the framework. So they're not only facilitating the engagement, but they're also guiding, and they're counseling. They're working as the intermediate between the project team, the government, and also the community. So they're really facilitating that maximum amount of collaboration, and they're basically at the local level. They're also very knowledgeable in the culturally respective communication process and interactions and that engagement. So they have that local expertise. What we decided to do was hire an Indigenous person who understood who was doing ITK, but also they are also very connected with the community. So the local community knowledge became very important for this particular role. So when conducting the interviews, we're zeroing in on, especially around the Indigenous Traditional Knowledge side of it, is working with the community leaders and also with the elder community to capture that core, traditional knowledge that's relevant to this particular project. So, and this sort of a face-to-face interaction is a bit challenging under COVID right now. So there might be a different view of working with the elder community because of the risks that COVID presents. So there's more openness to using technology, Zooming and all the rest of the kind of things that we're doing right now to create this somewhat semi-structured approach to getting Indigenous knowledge. And I think that's the key word, is that with dealing with the elder community, it's a very semi-structured view. Everything's happening at their pace, everything happening at their time, and respectfully from that standpoint. So when we're looking at the next part is the participation with the community. And the community becomes very important in this side of it, because they're also sharing their collective experience, so we're going to get to look at how flooding is impacting them, and what are their pain points, and so on and so forth. But also in the community engagement side of it, they also hear solutions, So now it's not becoming where the federal government is a fiduciary responsibility, but it's a very cooperative responsibility in terms of how they're going to manage the risks that are in the flooding, which is becoming more and more frequent under climate change. So those community success sessions are very participatory and add a tremendous amount of value to developing those guidelines. Finally, the end, as with the expert interview, this is where the science comes in. So what we're relying is on people that understand, as subject matter experts that understand hydrology, being able to map with the GIS side of it, understand, emergency managed planning, but also garnering their expertise, and basically marrying that with the Indigenous traditional knowledge. So we can build those climate models, and we can actually look at things that are, being able to do that risk mitigation. So the way we figured that would be easier is to basically zero in a few pilot projects and build on that experience on those pilot projects? What are the lessons learned, and what can come out of it? So you can actually take a really bad community that's heavily hit to a community that's very ready, so, and figuring out what are the conditions in between those communities. So this is a way of looking at developing those pilot projects and building on one successive project at a time, and looking at it maybe from different areas. But also looking at it from the standpoint of low-hanging fruit in communities that are ready and so on and so forth. So you're not pushing string up a hill. As you're developing those guidelines, but also recognizing that no community is alike. They probably have some similarity, but they're not alike. They have different needs. So as you learn from one project to the next, and what we're hoping to do is put this all into a recommendations and reports. So I'll just kind of give you what we're hoping to get from the outcomes. Is what we're trying to get is from developing the floodplain mapping guidelines series. Okay, it's as a living document. We're also identifying those key stakeholders out of the consultation process. Who should we be talking to? We also the role of Indigenous leadership have in the floodplain mapping process. So hopefully we're giving the NRCan or industry or emergency planning on who do they talk to, who do they coordinate within a community. Also developing those user requirements and those pilot studies, and so those pilot studies can come out and helping that define what those user requirements look like. But also, the engagement methods, the trust building that we're hoping to build into that with the communities, the advantages, the challenges, the consultation process. So we're hoping to bring, and the rules of engagement, the engagement, how do we properly engage with the community, and the effectiveness of engage, so, and the process of how do those activities go. So, but it's also looking at, and this is what we're going to talk a little about on the third project, but how the data sharing principles are, and the challenges for producing proposed solutions. So we're hoping to be able to get to that. With this project, we'll get there, but also more importantly, building those appropriate means of communicating with the with the Indigenous community regarding the floodplain mapping guidelines. So that's one view. The other view we're looking at is the project that we worked on is the OCAP principles. And this was done with Sherbrooke. It was a two-day, one-day work session, all-day work session, very intensive, where we brought together, working with NRCan, industry thought leaders. We also brought in institutions, academic institutions, but also institutions that are dealing with OCAP, and to look at what are the challenges. And so the real problem statement is, how can Indigenous communities or Indigenous data sovereignty and the use of traditional knowledge advance the public good? And in the public good, it was open data, and open data ran totally opposite with, Indigenous rights to govern their data, and, and decide who they share their data with. And when it comes to their land, their knowledge, their technology, and their resources. So open data runs totally opposite to that. So at the outcome of the workshop, with what came out of it was there's got to be collaboration, especially around the geomatic side. And what also came out of that workshop was everybody had a great appreciation for what OCAP is with respect to the geospatial data in regards to Indigenous communities and data sovereignty. So that was the outcome of that one-day session, which was very rich and dense. And what would need it to be was more sessions like that. So we came up with some recommendations and to adjust the three count. And these are the three big takeaways that we had with from the workshop was, there was limitations within the community to address. And with those limitations of capacity, both on the human resources side, but also the technological side, being able to be part of that and participate fairly will have impacts on communities' involvement in participating meaningfully in open data, in the open data environment. So it will be very hard for Indigenous people to protect their data if they don't have the tools to or the capacity to do that. and be able to manage it within that open data framework. There's also, what came out of this was also, there was no clear definition of OCAP and data sovereignty within the framework of an open data initiative. So it seemed that the open data initiative came first, and which was great and very important, and industry wanted, community and the non-Indigenous community wanted it as well, to be able to do the research. But the Indigenous community was not involved in that conversation. They were talking about OCAP and protecting data. So these were two parallel discussions that were going to eventually collide at one point in time as they moved, as open data wanted to now bring in the Indigenous community. So that was another challenge that came out of that. And of course, the continued dialogue between industry, Indigenous communities, and government before open data comes in, and how to incorporate it into, Indigenous data in the open data environment, an initiative. And that's that dialogue that needs to continue. So what's interesting was the biggest fear is like, what happens when, like for example, and you can see it pretty well, through climate change, we have a lot of tourism ships going in and they're running into whales and all sorts of things like that. How do you mitigate that, and bring that in traditional knowledge about migration and protection of the species and so on and so forth into an open data environment? Will it just find out when the whales are migrating and suddenly cruise ships will show up, because that's what sells voyages, So that's one thing that one looking at just in a microcosm, but there's larger issues as we expand. So there's more dialogue that was required. So these are the recommended steps that we had. One is government need to build greater awareness that there's this initiative, so they need to go back, put it out to the community. But also, the flip side of it is the OCAP needs to be more build awareness of inside of within government. It was funny to see how many government departments did not know about OCAP, or even industry even knew less about OCAP. So there's got to be greater awareness between these two. There's also pilot projects, one we recommended that with data-ready communities, and this can be a catalyst of learning to build trust. So as you learn from successive projects, no community is the same, they'll start understanding what the underlying issues and concerns are regarding OCAP and data sovereignty and how it can work in an open data environment. So what we recommended is that the government conduct town halls with selected communities, and again, maybe taking the worst community to the best community, the most ready community, and then be able to figure out what the path of what would be a path. So the partnering with groups like organizations with thought leadership. Like GeoIgnite conference, where we're here right now, is one way of being able to open up the dialogue with Indigenous organizations, but also the leadership that's out there. So then there's more dialogue around thought leadership, and that's what that workshop was able to produce. So we're hoping that there's more of that kind of dialogue, and of course, educating. And partnering with the economic development organizations, national organizations. And economic development organizations are really, they call them EDOs. They really are within the territory itself. They're responsible for building companies. They're responsible for, being able to create employment on and off reserve, believe it or not. And they also create these opportunities for the Indigenous community. So they become, and the national Indigenous organizations are a conduit for NRCan and industry to get direct feedback from the community. So they provide that good reach, and they're able to help build better trust within the community and within the organizations. Partnering with groups that are dealing with OCAP, it's like the Firelight Group, I think, is one of them. The other one is Indigenous Statistics Organization. I don't know if FINCI's still around, or First Nations Inuit Statistics Group, or derivative of, but those are the partnering groups that that government, and not only that, but industry wants to partner with. And then, of course, we said, well, let's take one fast track, one project that's going on, and try to bring all these elements in there and seeing how it plays out. Um, the thing about it is when we say fast track a project, go for the art of the possible, you know, because nothing's going to be perfect. We wait for something to be perfect, then it never moves forward. So, you know, be daring. And that's why we were saying we'll fast track these projects. And finally, and something that we did on our project, but what I think government, I think NR Canada has already done this, but hiring an Indigenous person who knows about Indigenous engagement, who has experience at ITK, and to work directly with communities and the department. And I think right now the University of Regina and especially out west, they have programs in ITK. They're doing masters and in traditional knowledge and community engagement. You know, that's part of a master's or a PhD program. So that's the way we kind of looked at being able to bring those next steps in. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I get very energized when I get a chance to do this, and I'm always very pleased to work on these particular projects. And I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to work on this project. And I hope that that it can generate some good questions. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, David. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot. What a fantastic talk. Yeah, we're the Q&A is open. We only have a short amount of time. We've got a hard stop coming up before the next talk, but maybe I'll get us started with a question. There was so much information, great information in your presentation. I'm always asking the question, how can the GeoIgnite community, how can Go Geomatics Canada engage with communities that we're not engaging enough with? We're working with you, bringing you into the conference, and I'd love to see more participation. What could, from your perspective, what could we do to engage more with kind of the Indigenous geospatial community, as it were?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think there's a lot of, you know, with AFN and with the, you know, the Métis National Council or even MMF, the Métis Manitoba Métis Federation. Some of these organizations with the Cree, they have geospatial talent within those particular groups. So inviting leadership along those lines, and they'll give a perspective about land sovereignty, to basically to the geospatial community. The other thing that I would highly encourage is bringing Indigenous Inc. inside of, you know, into these discussions, because they'll see opportunities being able to use geospatial technology and kind of push it forward. Industry today uses geospatial, you know, the mining industry, the forestry industry, and so on and so forth. And where Indigenous people are become passive users, but they become active users. And I'll give you a case in point. One community in BC, Vancouver, working with a forestry company, started using parrot drones to look for pine beetle infestation. So they didn't, you know, the community was actively involved, and they're feeding this information to their forestry partnerships, you know, especially around being able to choose which forests to cull or which forests to harvest. So that's one way. So bringing in Indigenous Inc. into this conversation, Indigenous leadership, and other areas where, you know, it'll be new to them. They're going to be taking in the knowledge, but they'll also be sharing their perspective.
Are there places that we can go? You mentioned Firelight in your talk. I think they've got a really excellent conference or event get together Do you know if they or others are going to be doing something in the future that we can engage with?
I imagine they would be. If they do, I highly encourage as many people to go to that as possible. Not just the scientific side, but also the industry partners, so the MDAs and the MaxRs and the fine people you have behind you that should attend these conferences. I think the thing about it is to go with sort of like with no expectations. It's hard for them to justify, well, I'm going to a conference, but no, I don't know what I'm going for. But I think that kind of just opens up a field of, that's going to, when the next time they go, they're going to have more and more things to add and so on and so forth. And flip side of it too, as well, is, as those dialogues happen, the Indigenous community will start knowing about what, conferences they should be attending as well. And I encourage them to go with no expectations as well, but just to take in as much information. That's been our approach to doing business, is when we do these conferences, we're there to learn. And then the following year, we start adding.
Well, that's a great strategy, one that I like to use as well. It's always best to listen first before I let everybody know how little I know. I'll wait to save that for later. So David, we've got another talk coming up, but I did want to mention that you're back with us tomorrow for the diversity leadership panel that was so successful and interesting last year. So thanks for being a part of that again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for the invite. And unfortunately, I talked too long.
No worries. It was all good stuff. My favorite expression for this event, taking GeoIgnite online, is we're building the boat as we sail it. So we're just going to roll with it. Thank you so much, and thank your team, and thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so interesting and it's so important. I'm looking forward to working with you again and learning more and seeing what we can do to engage.
Thank you so much again for the opportunity. We much appreciate it.
Thank you, David. All right, everybody, we're heading off to the break. In this room that's coming up next is MaxR. I'll see you soon.
See you.